Ladies and gentlemen, in the current geopolitical situation of war and economic crisis, one sometimes gets the impression that climate change and biodiversity loss are less prominent in the public discussion. But this COP27 brings back with full power the awareness of the ecological crisis we are in. We must not lose track, and we must also take care for sustainable finance. And with this, I very warmly welcome you at this German Pavilion side event on sustainable finance. It's organized by the federal government of Germany, and I also welcome all who follow us on the live stream. Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you're watching from. My name is Markus Pleyer. I'm the Deputy Director General in the Ministry of Finance of Germany, and we will start this session on sustainable finance with an intro statement by our Deputy Finance Minister, Florian Tonka.
Dear delegates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank the presidency of this year's COP27 in Sharm El-Sheikh for the opportunity to present our ideas and priorities when it comes to sustainability. Germany has always been a vocal supporter of the fight against climate change, and it is important to bring people together to find solutions. The location of the COP in Africa is a strong reminder that developing economies, while not contributing as much to climate change as industrialized countries, are often those that are most vulnerable to its negative effects. The German government firmly believes that international cooperation is key to overcoming the big challenges surrounding climate change. It will also be crucial to keep other vital issues in mind, such as biodiversity loss, food shortages, and social inequalities and missing opportunities. To do so, it will be important for all stakeholders to come together and work on solutions that not only achieve our ambitious goals, but do so in a just and fair way. The COP27, therefore, sets the right theme, and we as the German government are happy to be here and hope to contribute to a successful COP. On today's Finance Day, we would therefore like to put an emphasis on sustainable finance and the role it can play in helping countries and individual companies to transition. More specifically, our panel discussion focuses on the important role of transition plans and stress testing to help mobilize and allocate capital efficiently. In order to meet our mutual sustainability goals, huge investments are required. The International Energy Agency published a report last year where it found that roughly $5 trillion would be required yearly to achieve the transition to sustainability in the energy sector alone. It is obvious that the public sector cannot provide all those funds. The private sector will also have to contribute substantially. As capital is a scarce resource, it is of utmost importance that these investments are channeled in an efficient way. For this, we need decision-useful information on where capital will have the biggest impact and enable stakeholders to make use of this information. Reporting standards, which can be implemented globally, are therefore key. Furthermore, interoperability of jurisdictional and national standards with a global baseline worked out by the ISSB are essential. We are glad that this has been welcomed both by G7 members and also recognized by G20 members. But how can we get from reporting to making sustainable finance a useful tool for the transition? As you know, sustainable finance has two major objectives. The first one is to manage risks arising from the transition of our economic systems. These risks arise both from the physical impacts of climate change and the policies enacted to support the economic transition. It is important to stress test balance sheets against these risks and re-evaluate business models that fail to cope with changing conditions. This will help to identify stranded assets, prevent financial losses, and support financial stability. These stress tests will have to be well designed to be useful. In light of the global dimension of this challenge, as I mentioned in the beginning, these stress tests will also have to be adopted to and applied in all jurisdictions. The second objective of sustainable finance is to mobilize financial means for the transition. For the financial sector, great challenges lie ahead. It will have to identify and support future-looking companies, manage risks arising from the transition, and steer capital into the right direction. Transitioning to a sustainable economy is full of opportunities. As old business models vanish, new ones will emerge that will disrupt industries. Today, we probably cannot imagine the way our economies will work in 20 years. This uncertainty is both exhilarating and a great business opportunity, as all champions will lose market shares and new businesses will shine. The ultimate goal, of course, is to make our economies to transition onto sustainable paths. It is clear that backing the right horse has competitive advantages over following all trends. This is a strong market stimulus, certainly more effective than any regulatory constraints. That said, I would like to stress an important point. Investing into projects or companies that are already green today will not be sufficient to transition our whole economies into that direction. Instead, it will be important to support the transition of individual companies all the way on a credible pathway and with intermediate steps. This is especially true for those sectors that are a long way from green but are at the same time vital to the functioning of the economy. In many cases, the energy sector and large parts of the industrial sector are such examples. Building on that, the companies and financial industry could develop transition plans, use them to guide investments and to understand which next steps in the transition will have to be taken. It is, of course, difficult to develop these plans as they are future-looking. The difficulty is particularly acute in developing and emerging economies where climate-related data and disclosure remains limited. For investors, it will therefore be important to understand which methodologies have been used and what assumptions have been made. For both transition plans and stress testing, we thus face the challenge of credibility and methodology. Some questions we'll touch upon in our panel discussion will be how transition plans can be made credible and how stress tests could be designed. Also, we want to provide some insights on what information these tools can provide and which they cannot. Thus, stress tests are an opportunity to assess and manage risks and transition plans, and a tool to identify investment priorities and financing needs. This is especially true in emerging markets and developing countries where climate change risks are severe and investment opportunities significant. In our view, emerging economies can benefit greatly from using transition plans to attract capital. Take green hydrogen, for example. Hydrogen is supposed to be one of the important energy sources of the future. However, most countries that will have to rely heavily on green hydrogen for industrial processes do not have suitable conditions to produce the required amounts. Emerging economies, on the other hand, often do, but lack the necessary capital. By using credible transition plans that show how conventional power generation can be replaced by green energy, investors might be more willing to provide funding. The stringency and granularity of transition plans and stress tests likely differ depending on the development stage of countries. This should not become a hindrance to capital inflows, but rather serve as an impetus to strengthen global cooperation, capacity building, and peer learning. The German government already supports partner countries in transforming their financial systems and will continue to build on this experience. For example, we are collaborating with the central banks of Egypt and Brazil to enhance risk management capacities. We are also facilitating the transition of financial institutions, including through the recently launched Principles for Responsible Banking Academy, a collaboration with UNFCCC and the Chartered Banking Institute. We are very happy that Egypt is among the 3 countries in which this new training program on responsible banking will be piloted in the coming months. Events like this are great opportunities to share views, to learn from each other, and to identify areas for stronger collaboration. I wish us all fruitful discussions. Many thanks.
So thank you so much to our Deputy Minister Florian Tonka, and we now move on to a keynote by Sabine Mauderer, who is a member of the Executive Board of our central bank, Deutsche Bundesbank.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, a very warm welcome to the German Pavilion. We have come a long way since the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro 30 years ago. And yet, to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, we will have to step up climate action and scale up especially climate finance. Driving the green transition will require substantial public sector, but also and especially private sector engagement and financing. Let me briefly touch upon three aspects. First, the transition plans, some of it we heard already. Second, the scenario analysis and stress test. And third point, the role of central banks and supervisors in this regard. Let's start with transition plans. Financial market actors play a key role in scaling up climate finance. To make informed investment decisions, they need reliable, comparable, and especially forward-looking data. Solid and credible transition plans that lay out how financial institutions corporate plan to achieve their climate ambitions give investors a better idea if a company or a project is worth investing in. The United Kingdom has been a pioneer when it comes to transition plans. As from next year on, companies listed in the UK must put forward transition plans. In the European Union, mandatory disclosure of transition plans could also become part of the upcoming Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Although we see some development in this regard, there are lots of moving parts with regard to the transition plans. Let's look at the open questions. Let's start with first, what type of risk should be addressed in these transition plans? Should it be physical or transitional risk, or should we even take into account the risk of the loss of biodiversity? Second open question, which corporate should have to publish transition plans? Big corporates, or listed companies, or just companies from certain industries? And last but not least, who will check these transition plans and against which standards? So there are quite a few questions we have to deal with. So while much about transition plans is still up in the air, more experience is available with regard to scenario analysis. Scenario analysis can be a valuable strategic planning tool for companies because they can simulate the outcomes of different set of factors. These features can make scenario analysis an important part of transition plans. They allow the resilience of transition plans to be assessed under a variety of scenarios. So scenario analysis are also a valuable source of information for central banks and supervisors, and they can feed into so-called stress testing exercises. This enables central banks and supervisors to gauge the risk exposure of individual financial institutions, but as well as to the financial system and, of course, the economy as a whole. This summer, the European Central Bank Banking Supervision ran a climate stress test, and this stress test showed that many, also bigger banks, still have to do their homework when it comes to managing climate risk. That stress test of the European Central Bank was based on a set of scenarios developed by the so-called Network for Greening the Financial System, in short, NGFS. So what is the NGFS about? The NGFS is a technical platform, a network of now more than 120 central banks and supervisors, and this platform aims to support sustainable transition. The NGFS scenarios help to quantify the economic impacts of different emissions and policy pathways. The most recent update of our scenarios consider not only transitional risk, but also physical risk. And we also have a deeper look at the difference of regions and industries. So we are continuing to upgrade our scenarios and their practical usability, and we will also view on transition plans. So we are working out how transition plans of financial institutions or the real economy can relate to the supervisory's role and mandate, and how they could become part of the supervisory toolkit. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. Many aspects of transition plans are still up for discussion. And the same is true for the role of central banks and supervisors when it comes to checking these plans. Events like this are good opportunities to consider such fundamental questions. So let us discuss, and there's a distinguished panel to discuss this, the ways forward and find common ground internationally. The goal is clear. To define the ambitions is an easy part, but to turn these into ambitions into actions is what really matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine Mauderer, for providing us with your ideas. I think they're a good start and base for our discussion. And may I now ask the panelists to come forward. Okay.
Now I understood everything. Great. Great topic.
Good, good. So I think these two statements by our Deputy Minister and our member of the Central Bank have been an excellent introduction for our panel discussion. We have heard that sustainable finance has two major objectives. First one is managing risks arising from the transition of our economies, and the second is mobilizing finance for the transition. And stress tests are a tool to assess and manage risks, and transition plans are a tool to identify financial needs and investment priorities. So we will now look closer to how transition plans can be more credible, made credible, how stress tests should be designed, and what information these tools can provide and which not. And these questions I want to discuss with my distinguished panelists, and here we have, and I start with the guest from our host country, Egypt. We have Dalia Abdelkader, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Commercial International Bank of Egypt, and she's also a board member of the UNFCCC Principles for Responsible Banking. And I think you're also teaching courses on sustainability at the American University in Cairo. So very warm welcome. Then we have with us from the Brazilian Ministry of Economy, Raquel Breira dos Santos, General Coordinator for Global Development Institutions. And I think she has experience since the 90s in the area of environmental protection and sustainability. Welcome. Then from Japan, Mr. Masimichi Kono joins us as a trustee of the IFRS Foundation and as a member of the Mitsubishi Financial Group's Global Advisory Board. He has been a member, a former Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, where we have met before. And prior to that, he has been Vice Minister for International Affairs at the Japanese FSA, and chairman of the IOSCO board, the standard setter in the area of securities regulation. So he has a long career in financial supervision and regulation. Then we have with us former vice president of the World Bank Group and sitting vice president of the International Sustainability Standards Board, Mr. Yingdong Hua. He has been responsible, I think, for green bond initiatives at the World Bank and also for sustainable finance capacity building. So very warm welcome to you as well. And then we have Professor Stefan Brunhuber, who is joining as a member of the German Sustainable Finance Advisory Council. He's also a member of the Club of Rome and trustee of the World Academy of Science and Arts. Welcome. And last but not least, we have one member joining us online, which is Mr. Stefan Schnell, Head of Reporting at BASF, which is the largest chemical producer in the world. He is Senior Vice President responsible for BASF's group reporting and performance management, and he leads BASF's sustainability finance activities. So with this, let's start with the discussion. And my first question is, how can transition plans and stress tests mobilize finance towards net zero? How effective do you consider these tools to channel private money into the green transition? Maybe Professor Brunhuber, would you like to kick off?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here at the panel and putting these two aspects, transition plans and stress tests, right in the center of the entire debate. You know, years ago we wouldn't have a COP meeting talking on finance, and now we have a whole day where finance is right at the center, right? We're learning that if we want to transit from fossil to green, we've overlooked the purpose and the architecture of the financial system and the monetary system to enable all that. Let's look closer to the stress tests and transition finance. You know, what I'm learning here at COP is the private sector is ready for change. They are sitting in the driver's seat and want the change. But as soon as it comes to investment, the question is, who is hedging the risk ahead, especially in the global south, right? And here we have to distinguish between risk and uncertainties, right? Risks you can really quantify and put a price tag on and can hedge. But most of the challenges ahead are actually not risks. They are uncertainties. They remain kind of incomplete as a systems dynamic within the system. So to give a short answer to your complex question, stress tests are a first start, but just a first start towards what I would call not only financing the change or financing transition, but transition finance, where we start talking about a new financial architecture that hedges and manages all the challenges ahead.
Thank you for these introductory remarks and pointing to the relevance that sustainable finance has got also for this COP27. Can I now turn to Raquel? What is your perspective on this question?
Well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And as the professor was saying, not just we have a finance day, but I think finance is one of the main questions that we have been discussed and will be still discussed until the end of this COP, because it's absolutely central for sustainability and climate. As for your question, certainly climate transition plans and stress tests represent two instruments that can help mobilize private capital for the global as well as national climate goals. Yet, they are quite different tools, and each of the concepts by itself has very different possible approaches. First, climate stress tests have shown to be a very important tool for central bank and supervisors to incorporate climate considerations in prudential regulation and supervision. The Central Bank of Brazil, as the Deputy Minister was saying, has recently introduced climate stress tests into its regulatory framework and monitoring practices. Both for supervisors and regulated entities, it is an important tool First of all, to familiarize themselves with what climate change and the transition to low-carbon economies mean for business and the economy and financial systems. This includes accounting both for physical climate risks, such as intensifying droughts, but also for transition risks, like the likely rise of carbon taxes in both domestic and international markets. Climate stress tests, hence, can help us better understand possible future scenarios and their impacts and risks for economy, the financial system, and ultimately for society. This way, they can help build resilience against these risks if we act upon their results. This implies, for example, considering stress testing results to inform financial decision-making, including shifting capital to low-carbon activities to reduce further emission growth and investing into adaptive capacities to build resilience. Transition plans, on the other hand, help guide the transition to low-carbon or carbon-neutral economies. We must recognize that for many companies and financial institutions, this will not occur from one day to the next. It is a process that will be more lengthy and cumbersome for some companies and sectors than for others. Especially for the hard-to-abate industry, such as steel, iron, or cement, low-carbon production is today yet not feasible at large scale. So, we must talk more about transition finance and how to guide companies and the financial sector into the transition. A challenge is certainly that there are many different understandings out there of what transition finance is. Unfortunately, this also opens the door for greenwashing sometimes, consciously, but perhaps more often unintended. Transitions plan and stress tests can complement each other by setting a clear pathway to climate neutrality and by helping anticipate and manage climate-related risks properly, thereby promoting the shift of capital into low-carbon, climate-resilient investments. But for any of them to be effective, complementary economic and financial sector policies and incentive mechanisms are required to generate a meaningful impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights. And now I turn to Ms. Abdelkader. Would you like to share with us your view?
Yeah. But I would like to...
It's coming.
Yes, it's not working?
Yes, it is.
After all the sufferings. I would like to build on two valuable statements made by my colleagues on the panel. New financial architecture and the fact that stress testing and transition plans are different, right? They are related, but they are different. And I would like to make a general statement. Of course, I would like to welcome you all here in Sharm El-Sheikh. With regards to the regulatory scene in Egypt, both the Central Bank of Egypt and the Financial Regulatory Authority now mandate climate risk stress testing and scenario analysis. It's mandated. If we zoom further on our experience as Commercial International Bank, and we are Egypt's largest private sector bank, we subscribed to the TCFD a year ago. We were the first bank in Egypt, and we are co-founding signatory of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Principles for Responsible Banking. Mm-hmm. So we have the two approaches right now on our table. Mm-hmm. To be able to address these two frameworks, we had to establish a very robust structure, systems, governance structure inside the bank. So we are there. Now that we are there, we are facing the challenge of stress testing, right? Because we care about the health of our portfolio. It's risk management tool, period. I mean, the impact of climate on the resilience of our portfolio. And we are in the middle of stress testing, scenario analysis, establishing a climate change strategy. So this is scenario analysis. It's risk management. Moving to transition plan, which is under the net zero. When we joined the net zero in April 2021, there was no stick. It was voluntary. We opted to join the net zero commitment because of the business case, because it purifies your portfolio. I mean, you don't want to end up with stranded assets. So we are there because of the business case. And this gets me further gets the discussion towards the implementation of the transition plan. And let me surprise you that we as a bank, we started practically the transition plan not only in our bank, but also with our clients. Because we started, I mean, you cannot go through the transition alone as a bank. If you don't do it with your clients, it's meaningless. It takes two. So we started to address our clients, and the starting point was elaborating on the business case of decarbonization. So forget about the net zero commitment. It's not a commitment. There is a business case for decarbonization. The starting point the main hurdle in Africa or in MENA, that we are not emitters. I mean, if the whole of Africa shuts down, the carbon emission, the global warming will not be impacted, right? We agree on that. However, our mandate or the importance of the net zero because of the business case, because you want to assume new ways of growth. You cannot grow the old way. So this is why we are committed. Practically speaking, it has been working with our clients. We developed the Sustaining Sector Program. It's a sector-focused program on textile, pharmaceutical, oil and gas, power, whereby we convene with our clients and potential clients, and we introduce the business case. We introduce sustainable finance products like energy efficiency, renewable energy, a whole portfolio. We bring them certification like the EDGE, for example. And we manage them to get certified. We get policymakers on board. We introduce the matter into academia, because if you don't get it into academia, you are starting it all again. The Sustaining Sector Program is very promising. And right now we are celebrating. We even started to train auditors to be certified for EDGE certification. That wasn't the case in Egypt. So what you're witnessing is a new role on part of financial institutions, that of advocacy. The ecosystem, you're moving together the whole ecosystem to go through the low carbon economy, not only a low carbon economy, the circular economy as well. The point is, transition finance will never take place because there is a disconnection between investors, and you rightfully said, now we have $130 trillion under the GFANZ. And I remember back in Glasgow, I heard this statement which resonates with me. The supply side is here. The demand is not there, which is the packaging of pipeline of investable projects. And that's the issue. This morning I had a session and I was introducing a new concept. It's called brain trust. What's brain trust? It's commercializing adaptation. Adaptation should have a business case, and we should work on it because it's about food systems and mitigation. What we need, because there is money. The global system has $379 trillion waiting to be invested in sustainable projects. What we need from the developed countries, not funds, by the way. It's not funds, and it's not concessional loans that we need. We need your help to package investable projects. So technology comes, research, academia. How to make a food agriculture project or even desalination project investable. It's developing or innovating in the climate finance instrument, which is going well. We issued the green bond. It was very successful. And the green bond has adaptation projects that were offered for commercial loans. So the business case for mitigation and adaptation is there. The money is there. The transition will take place if we join hands and start to package investable projects, and you just connect the dots. We don't need anything else. We are disconnected and we are fragmented. So if you just provide the technology of it, the science of it, the data, the tools, we are there. Just that.
That's very exciting to listen to your practical experiences in an Egyptian bank. That brings me to our next question, which is how can corporates and the financial industry use transition plans and stress tests to improve internal governance and guide investments? And how can the financial industry reward compliance? Maybe we can start with Mr. Kono.
Yes, thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Great honor and pleasure to be here. Well, in a way, if I may, I would just turn around a bit that question, because when you say how can corporates and the financial industry use transition plans, for a bank like MUFG that has made a net zero commitment to 2050, including the entire financial portfolio, in fact, having a credible transition plan for our clients is essential. It is indispensable, because if those client firms don't succeed in achieving net zero, or if their transition plans are derailed, then the bank itself will not be able to achieve its 2050 goal. And so, in a way, you cannot decouple the transition plans of those client firms from the bank's transition plan. And now, what does that mean for the business? We have to engage with those clients. And of course, some elements of that Dalia has already mentioned, and so I don't want to repeat what she has said. But in our case, we do need those transition plans coming from our clients, but then this is not going to happen automatically, because we already have a $3 trillion balance sheet, meaning that we have, of course, outstanding loans that will eventually be either renewed or rolled over or switched. But just to make this, in a way, green in the next decade, and for the interim target, and then, of course, up to 2050, we have to work with those clients to come up with credible transition plans for them. And that's why also we think client engagement is really the key here. Also, that means that, of course, when giving new loans, the screening process will have to be completely different from the traditional way, in the sense that, of course, we have to look at, again, the credibility of their transition plans. And based on that, of course, if we find that those plans are basically Paris aligned, and that there are KPIs that we can use to measure progress, and with all the other elements, I mean, those elements I don't want to repeat, because a recent OECD report actually puts forward 10 basic elements for a credible transition plan for corporates, and that is a useful guide. But then we can't stop there again, because no firm, well, almost no firm in the world will have a perfect 100% fail-proof transition plan in place as of today. So again, we have to sit down with those clients and certainly go through very patiently, help capacity building both on our side and their side, and of course we need the help of auditors and so on. So this comes back to the ecosystem that was just mentioned. And anyway, maybe I should stop here. But how can we reward? Well, the reward is, of course, we can give better terms in our loans or other financial services that we provide.
Thank you. We now heard voices from the financial industry. Let's now turn to our corporate and to our online participant and give him the opportunity to come in. Mr. Schnell.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for the invitation, and I hope you well. I see Mr. Kono. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we do. Okay.
Okay, super. Thanks.
Good. Go ahead.
So thanks again for having me, and thanks for the invitation to this very interesting panel on this very relevant topic. I would take a similar approach as Mr. Kono and also turn the question a little bit around. because for me it should actually read, how does a sound internal governance rather facilitate the use and the establishment of transition plans and stress tests. So I think at the beginning should really be the governance aspect, which we tend to sometimes neglect when we talk about sustainability. We often talk about environmental topics, social topics, and the G comes a bit at the end. I think sometimes we should really make sure that we also include the governance aspect into our thinking. And here, maybe just to bring an example from our industry, because the chemical industry by nature is a very long-term thinking industry. When you make an investment in chemicals, you do this basically for decades, and you have a very thorough process that you are running through on a regular basis to examine on how your markets are going to develop, how your supply is going to develop, what competition is going to do. And for instance, BASF, we are going through a kind of strategic review process every year in order to see what might have changed, what has remained constant, and what does that mean for our kind of long-term development. And I think companies will need to implement such a kind of almost natural rolling strategic process to constantly review their positioning and continuously test whether their transition plans are still on track, and do a stress test on actually those transition plans and their future plans in terms of financial developments. Maybe a quick comment also on those kind of transition plans. I think something that we should also bear in mind is that the requirements towards those plans and also these stress tests should be somewhat realistic. I mean, it's all about forward-looking information. It's all about, as Mr. Kunubo has said, about uncertainty. So we should really focus on the key drivers that influence the resilience of companies or financial markets, and do not become too granular. So I think if we set up a methodology and a system that is easy to understand, easy to navigate, easy to communicate, that is rather beneficial compared to a sometimes too detailed approach that I perceive. So really focusing on the key issues, the key drivers for change, I think would help compared to sometimes too granular approaches that I've seen. And to conclude, something that has also been mentioned already, when it comes to lack of demand and uncertainties, I think something that corporates will need in order to develop sound transition plans is a certain planning horizon and planning stability. And that also calls to governance and countries to develop a framework that is stable and predictable under all uncertainties that I fully recognize, in order to enable companies really to plan ahead and implement accordingly. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. I think we all agree that transparency is key in this area, and data play a key role. For that reason, I would like to concentrate now 2 questions on data, and before we move to how data can be used, I would like to ask the question, which data and types of information do financial market participants need from corporates to make meaningful investment decisions? What works for supervisors as well, the internal governance of corporates? So I wonder again whether Mr. Kono would like to come in on that question.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, it's a bit difficult in this setting to go into details, and I'm also not a frontline loan officer, let's say. So I will have to keep my remarks at a relatively general level. But what I can say is that maybe in agreement with what Dr. Schnell just mentioned, I mean, we talk about those the sets of data that investors need, or maybe our stakeholders need more broadly consumer groups, etc. There can be a long list of data points and also time horizon, etc. There's no limit to that, but then very often what happens is that we get lost in this, let's say, pile of data that we collect, and in the end, since I did a bit of economic forecasting at the OECD in my younger days, we find that much of that data can be revised one day, totally negative growth turning to positive, just an assumption being changed that will turn around a current account deficit into surplus. I mean, for companies also, I mean, there's so much uncertainty that over-reliance on data would certainly not be particularly useful. So a simple set of data, reliable data. Also, when it comes to what maybe later Jindo might want to refer to of this issue of decision useful data, but for whom? And well, the ISSB in a way decided to focus on the investor. Now, I think your question is more to me was what data would be useful for corporates. Well, corporates actually need almost the same data to manage risk and to also be able to seize the opportunities. And in a way, you can't really manage what you can't measure. So I would say this standardized set of data that eventually those ISSB standards will require will also be extremely useful for corporates to actually draw up their own transition plans and for conducting stress tests based on some scenarios. And in a way, this question over the difference between financial reporting and sustainability reporting, single materiality versus double materiality, is conceptually interesting, but for a bank or a corporate, that's not really the issue, right? I mean, well, I mean, a loan officer normally knows what data he needs to judge whether this project is bankable or whether this company is worth providing loans to. And then on top of that, we add a credible transition plan, and that's basically what we need.
Thank you. Mr. Schnell, what data do you think banks need from corporates like BASF?
Would be rather a question to ask the banks, I would say. But first, let me ask, kindly apologize with Mr. Kono, because I'm not a formal doctor, so I very much appreciate me being called doctor, but it's not what I would want to claim. Now, nevertheless, I think what banks should look for, and I think what would make sense, and here I'm absolutely agreeing to what Mr. Kono said, is that data should be meaningful, it should be impactful, it should be decision relevant, both for investors and for corporates alike, and that should be the same data. So the decisions that they should, or that banks should take and the corporate should actually be the same. And I think what is extremely important, and we can also talk about this during our panel, is consistency of data between different frameworks. And here I'm also talking about my role in the Sustainability Reporting Board of EFRAG, where we are also kind of working with ISSB to seek a close alignment. And I think what is extremely important in the current situation, where we are coming from a very big number of different frameworks, initiatives, rating agencies, all asking for different kinds of data, is that we gravitate towards consistent sets of data and consistent definitions. And that is not just a kind of technical issue, it's really something about credibility of data, the meaningfulness of data. And here I think international alignment between global initiatives such as the ISB, regional initiatives such as the one under EFRAG is truly crucial to drive consistent kind of data analysis and ultimately consistent action, and not just debates over data and meaning of data.
You would like to share your views?
Yes. Regarding data, you're right. I mean, it depends. We report on 11 international frameworks: SASB, GRI, PRI, PRB. So the data depends on the framework. However, if talking about transition, because we are very much in the middle of, we just issued our net zero reporting, and we established the baseline scenario. We picked the most polluting sectors, and we said this is the baseline. However, we did not set targets. We were required to set targets as how much carbon emissions will be committed to, which we abstained from because it is still tedious and granular. And here my colleague engineer, she's an environmental specialist, which is something I would like to mention, that in banks now, we are depending on environmental specialists, environmental engineers to help us with this. This is a new genre for bankers. We have to admit, we are all, I mean, we're very much settled with financial data and the IFRS, it's part of our fabric. But what we are required to report on is completely alien. So we started to get new discipline inside. It's working. I was just discussing with engineer Wala, what do you want from our clients prior to our, and she said we want from them their emission and the emission factor for each sector, which should be set on the national level and on the sectoral level. So it's quite complex. We're still starting to decipher, but it's working. We subscribe to the PCAF and the GIM to help us as a bank report on carbon emissions. We're trying to connect with clients to show them how to establish new tools. So what we want from our clients with regards to the transition is their carbon emissions and the revenue. I mean, there's a formula which relates the amounts, the outstanding amounts of our loans with their emissions. And it's a learning curve, but we are progressing.
Okay, thank you. Professor Brunner, did you want to come in?
I just want to pour some water in the wine. You know, if you look at the databases, I mean, at the most, on a corporate level, we have 35 to 40% of relevant data upstream and downstream and within the corporate itself. Not talking about the systemic risks, the collective risks affecting the corporate as a whole. So we got to be very, very careful when talking about risk assessment, and we're very, very careful talking about uncertainties. There's a lot to do. I like your term when you say connecting the dots, right? We have to connect the dots between the private and the public sector. And at that knot, we have to be very, very clever and come up with new financial engineerings, new financial assets to hedge the risks in order to mobilize the trillions the private sector is prepared to invest.
Yeah. I think this also raises the question of credibility of data, about comparability and accountability. So how can we make the data comparable for global investors? Maybe this is a good question for Mr. Hua.
Well, indeed. First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. Thanks to the German government and corporate sector for supporting ISSB. Our headquarters is in Frankfurt and also in Montreal. So before I offer my comments, I just wanted to say that in my previous job as a World Bank Group, I led the creation and issuance of many sustainability-related bonds, from green bond, forest bond, gender bond, social bond, including their disclosure, their green bond standards, social bond standards. So coming from that background to the standard-making world is one experience I have. The other is that I also wear the hat. I was the head of the World Bank Group Pension Fund, where the World Bank Pension Fund was a signatory to the UNPRI. principle for responsible investment. So combining these two, here's my angle and wearing my new hat, is that number one, what gets measured gets done. So you need to measure things. Better information leads to better decision, right? And the third is that for things to happen systemically, you have to turn voluntary to mandatory. So I'm going to combine the three things into what we do at ISSB. And I have to give credit to my boss as a trustee of the IFS Foundation, because as you know, if you go back 20 years, every country has a different accounting standard. So when you're an investor, when you try to analyze corporate performances, you know, they are different. This P&L is different than the other one, right? The incredible job the IFS Foundation did through the International Accounting Standard Board is to convert into a global standard called the International Accounting Standard. Now, over 170 countries are on International Accounting Standard. It makes the job of the investor much easier to compare, to make decisions. So the creation of the ISSB is exactly the same idea, tapping into the credibility, the rigor, the transparency of the accounting standard making into sustainability standard making to be decision useful for investors. Now, my Egyptian bank colleague mentioned that the global savings pool is about $300+ trillion, right? Now, the UNPRI signatory already represents over 120 trillion, a third of it. Actually, there are other investors on other responsible investment platforms. So when you mention there is not enough investable project, it probably is a data problem, right? Because there is no consistent data to be mandated for the users of finance to disclose. Therefore, investors cannot be. So this is where the ISSB standard is so critical, that we are creating a global baseline for sustainability matters that are material to companies, to investors, right? So we were created at COP26 a year ago with the endorsement of G20, G7, IOSCO, and we are only 1 year old, but we are already not only walking, we are running. So hopefully by sometime next year, our two first standards will come out. The first one is a general requirement or framework on how companies should disclose their sustainability related matter, including transition plan, including scenario analysis, right? That broadly follows the TCFD framework, that you have to tell us how your governance works. What are your strategy on transition, your net zero, and what are the risks and opportunities for your transition plan, you know, for your business decision related to sustainability. And last but not the least, the matrix and targets. These are the data that are useful. The second standard is specifically related to climate, GHG, emissions, so on and so forth. There, we are requiring scope 1, 2, and 3, including the supply chain, value chain disclosure. Of course, scope 3 having some challenges because of lack of data or readiness. So we are going to provide some relief or safe harbor depending on jurisdiction, but that's a requirement. Again, we are folding in SASB, we are folding in CDSB. So from, for you as a user, instead of having to comply with very alphabetic soup of different voluntary standards, by making ISSB the single global mandatory standard, it will simplify on the burden of the company to report, but you report on a same data requirement, same format. It simplifies the job of the investor. The last thing I wanted to say is that we could not be a true global standard if a year later you have 90% of global north on your standard, but only 10% of global south, right? But it is also a fact that global south may have a gap from the readiness to their current state. Therefore, we are making capacity building an integral part of our job, so to make conditions ready for accelerated adoption by the global south of our standard. So hopefully this will be a critical element to unlock this 120 trillion on the UNPRI, the 300 trillion now, investment opportunities for solar energy in Nigeria, in Egypt. That company complies with ISSB standard. Therefore, they are eligible for me as a responsible investor. So that's a journey we're traveling. Bear with us. But capacity building is critically important for accelerated adoption, in developing countries, in addition to the global north. But let me stop here.
Thank you so much for this very strong message to avoid the mistakes of the pre-IFRS history and not to fall again into fragmentation. Right. Would you like to come in? Okay.
So much of thought-provoking, and I have 5 comments. I will do it. First, when we talk about transition and capacity building, I hate to talk about South-North because it is a global issue. And I think a fundamental issue here is that it is politicized to North-South. It's one globe. However, the fact that 80% of the emissions come from the North, who are educated and who have the capacity building, and we are saying that the South needs capacity building. The whole South contributes something like 10 or 20%. So when I work on the Net Zero Banking Alliance and I address African banks, if we shut Africa, emissions will not change. But China, the States, Europe. So what's your take on that? This is the first thing. You want to react?
May I answer that?
Yeah.
So for the past 3 decades, I worked in international development, started in Africa. I lived in Africa 3.5 years, almost 30 years ago, working for the African Bank, then United Nations, Asian Bank, and the World Bank Group, right? My heart is in development. What you said is very true in terms of who had, actually contributed.
The 1.5 degree doesn't lie in Africa. The challenge lies in China, United States, and Europe.
Yeah, so this is a fact. That said, we are facing the twin problem of climate change and the urgent need for development in developing countries. The two have to come together. The fact of the matter is not enough investment flows are coming to the global south.
I don't want
That's
it
a fact,
either.
right?
Bear with me. If we want to reach the 1.5 degree challenge and stop the global warming, it is Europe, China, and the States.
But I don't disagree with you. But meanwhile, there are still global south needs more electricity.
Definitely.
Right? So investment coming to renewable energy in the global south is a good thing.
Definitely.
While contributing to reaching the Paris goal. I don't think we have any.
I wouldn't agree more.
Disagreement here. I wouldn't have any disagreement here, and there is no the distinction, and this is a United Nations approach, right? Common but differentiated responsibility in achieving climate change, right? Common is that we live in one planet. Nobody can escape this. Differentiated responsibility means recognizing the historic contribution and how do we then make sure. This is why the commitment of 100 billion from the global north supporting the global south to address this equality. And I think this global standard will unlock investment to the global south for sustainable development, right? Whether it's education, gender, entrepreneurship, renewable energy, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So the standard itself, while demanding that they will disclose climate and other sustainability, is essentially equipping global south company for them to be eligible to welcome global investment. So I don't think we have any disagreement there.
Mr. Kono, we just heard that you are the boss of Mr. Hua. So
yes.
Would you agree with the view of your subordinate?
I think it's the complete opposite because the board has really been making great progress in just 12 months, let's say. And this is all to the credit of Jin Dong and his colleagues, and we're just so appreciative And the trustees' role is to help the board do a good job by providing the necessary funding, making the right appointments, designing the organizational structure, and so on. So we are really the serving the board as the facilitator. But anyway, it's really great that the ISSP is making such fast progress. But then, if I may come back to that question of data, actually, I would still, of course, caution against the over-reliance on granular data. But at the same time, I think what the ISSP is doing is, of course, working on what the data should be disclosed in a mandatory manner across countries in the future. That is because, of course, we have different countries in different situations, and of course there's this issue of scalability, of about the capacity building of emerging and developing economies. All that will have to be addressed. But what they're doing is not just about disclosure in a way. I mean, you will probably agree that, of course, disclosure is only the first step for funds to flow properly to the right projects, the right companies, and particularly support the transition. But in fact, by identifying the data that is required to be disclosed, you're actually going into this area of what data are actually meaningful for investors' decisions, and then those investor the data that are decision useful for investors are actually decision useful for the corporate management as well, because of course management needs to manage the company so that it can attract investment, it can be first of all profitable, but also be able to make the right investments. And so all this is really building an infrastructure that does not end with disclosure. So again, a long way of saying we're really thankful to the ISSP for embarking on this. And this will be really the basis for identifying what data will be decision useful for everyone else. And the risk here is, of course, that we may, if things go wrong, end up in a fragmented world, because the US may have something different, Europe may be slightly different, Japan may be different. We want to avoid that, and there the word interoperability is key.
Thank you. I would like to turn now to the emerging markets and developing economies, and ask whether transition plans and stress tests help mobilizing private climate finance in these economies, or is there a risk that it leaves some of these countries behind? How concrete can they be, especially in the context of these economies, and what can be done to improve uptake of these instruments in emerging markets and developing economies? Raquel, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you. I think there is not an easy answer for your question, because related to the effectiveness of transition plans and stress tests. As in other markets, they alone will be insufficient to mobilize private finance at scale in the short and in the long run. First of all, they must be coherent with other policies, regulations, and incentives to shift domestic and international climate flows. Transition plans and stress tests can complement policies for the real economy and the financial sector, be it in developed countries or in EMDEs. But emerging markets certainly face different challenges and additional. For example, public budgets are typically a lot tighter. So this means less available resources to set financial incentives to promote transition investments. Another challenge is that many of these countries are a lot more exposed and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in general. This bears a certain risk of negative impacts of stress tests, as their results will obviously show higher financial risks in regions and sectors that are most vulnerable to climate change. As a consequence, if stress tests are not accompanied by effective adaptation and support measures, companies and communities in those regions and sectors may get an even worse position, as access to finance could become even harder and most costly. This possible negative effect of climate stress tests and how to avoid it is currently, unfortunately, not being discussed enough. Another challenge is that the question of how to support small and medium-sized enterprises in the transition and support capacity to enable them to adhere to international sustainability standards, considering that SMEs often have lower financial capacities and technical expertise in comparison to large, globally operating companies. As international requirements on sustainable supply chains are getting higher, we should ensure that they do not leave behind SMEs, risking driving them out of markets, rather than supporting and incentivizing the adoption of more sustainable practices. This is another possible negative unintended impact that requires attention. Lastly, we must also recognize that private finance is not fit for many of the sustainability challenges that we are facing. The private sector certainly needs to be on board to achieve the Paris targets. Nevertheless, both private and public, domestic and international finance need to contribute to the implementation of national pathways to low carbon and climate neutral economies, and also to the achievement of other sustainability goals. Lastly, given the challenges that many emerging economies and developing economies still face, international public finance continue to represent a most important pillar for increasing finance support for climate programs and actions in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. And I think next one is Professor Brunhuber.
Yeah, I will. Exactly, right? How can we get the rubber on the road, right? You know, Ghana has a lot of wind and a lot of sun, right? But running their energy supply fossil still. And if you ask why they don't switch to renewables, they say it's simply too expensive, right? The capital costs in Ghana are 5 times higher than the capital costs in Germany for the same technology, for the same windmill, for the same solar panel. So if you take such examples and break it down on a country level, on a corporate level, what's required basically is that the African Developing Bank or the World Bank Group is upfront funded and loaded with additional liquidity that hedges these 5 times of risks between Ghana and Germany. That's the point in one sentence. And if we only have 40% of the data, we cannot wait another 10 years until we get all the data from Ghana. This is not a way to do it. The point is, the World Bank or the African Development Bank is going to upfront fund this hedge. In case of a default, they have to basically write it off. It's a public good. In case of a win, Ghana is green. Right? That's the point.
Okay, thank you. We now turn to Mr. Hua.
Yes, well, having worked at AFDB and World Bank, I wanted to give you a positive example. That is the Nubisan solar farm in Egypt. A couple of years ago, the World Bank worked with the Egyptian government. Instead of in the past, where each solar, from Germany, from other countries, approaching Egyptian government saying that I'd like to build a solar farm, they each have to negotiate a separate power purchase agreement, legal framework, whatever it is. Instead, I think this time, the World Bank Group with the Egyptian government we had a comprehensive plan saying that, okay, within the next couple of years, how many solar farms, can we do? And so that at the end of the day, there was a plan, there was an open process. We are building 13 solar farms in one go. And you all use the same power purchase agreement guaranteed by MIGA, right, on the back end. And ISC, which I was working at, went to mobilize commercial syndicated loan. $600 million were raised. This was one of the largest scaling solar. If you go to the World Bank website, go to search scaling solar. This is a great example of efficiency, transparency, trust. Another thing I wanted to say, having worked in the private sector, is that when you mention Ghana risk is 5 times higher than Germany, I don't agree. Because when you look at the 20-year track record of ISC, African Bank working in the private sector in Africa, there is a huge gap between real risk and perceived risk. The real risk is much, much lower than perceived risk. Of course, when ISC, the AFDB, do a private sector investment, because of its public mandate, it's not like a hedge fund who will run away in the first sign of trouble. Because of a public mandate, they stay, they help the local company to work out the challenges. Therefore, they recover much more. So, actually, I created a platform called MCPP in IC that attracted 6 global insurance companies with a $10 billion platform that invest shoulder to shoulder with ISC on developing country project. Because at the end of the day, if you are patient capital, if you look through economic cycle, you diversify your portfolio, the actual performance is much higher than the perceived credit rating. Sorry, World Bank should pay me some money by still saying this, but I just wanted to
We're going
say
to
this.
clear that bilaterally, okay?
So since we had this interesting ping pong between Mr. Hua and Mrs. Abdelkader, I would like now to give Mrs. Abdelkader the possibility to come in.
I totally agree about de-risking is the function of MEGA, Islamic Development Bank. There are lots of insurers and de-risking, and they're there. They're just not connected enough to the big picture. Another way to de-risk a project is through the financial structuring. How it is structured? Through the financial innovation in financial instruments, and this is not tapped enough. So the de-risking is not an issue, by the way. It's just how, again, to package the pipeline projects. Another thing I really liked, the perception of risk. I think it's a very insightful remark. And here, but I don't want to be disruptive further. We're about to conclude. However, a new proposition in COP27. What if we factor in carbon in sovereign debt? Africa will be a creditor. And this is fair. Now we have carbon pricing. We need to have a level playing field. So we cannot grow right now because of the sovereign debt and because of the geopolitical. But if we have carbon pricing and we factor it in sovereign debt, we're not negotiating. No pledge broken, nothing. It's business. This is something to be called, because if this takes place, and again, I don't want to have the North-South dialogue. It's a very retro narrative from the 70s. It doesn't serve anyone. However, if we do this, funds will start to flow, and there is no one winner. We're all in the same boat. It's a non-zero sum game. You get me? So de-risking is a function of structuring projects along with entities. And again, it's a function of revising economic fundamentals, macro fundamentals, which we have not tapped. And congratulations for the ISB. I didn't have time to tell you. That was a highlight, a high point of Glasgow. That was really good.
Thank you. Let's use the remaining 5 minutes to shed light on an aspect that Mrs. Abdelkader raised when she's talked about new genre of jobs in the banks. I think this raises the question of expertise that we need in the banks for sustainable finance. And it's often perceived as the bottleneck. So what is your strategy in building the required expertise in-house? Raquel, would you like to come in first? Very quickly, maybe we can restrict everyone to 1 minute and then we can make it.
Yes, I can. Well, it is. Can you hear?
Just start
okay.
speaking and then it works.
Certainly the challenges in Brazil are certainly similar to those of many other countries. We certainly have needs in further policy development, data availability and quality, as well as capacity building. Brazil's regulatory frameworks on social environmental risk management, responsibility policies and transparency for financial institutions have been quite well developed for many years and were updated last year to explicitly include climate aspects in line with TCFD recommendations. But the policy and regulatory frameworks for the broader financial systems, including capital markets, has certainly potential to evolve further. Like in other countries, it is a long path to align policies across the whole economic and financial sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Mr. Hua, would you like to give us a short insight?
Well, I want to make peace instead of. Can I tell a different story? Because at the end of the day, I agree with you. Financial innovation, new ways of thinking, could really solve problems. The World Bank recently issued a Rhino bond, right? Very interesting. Investors, these are private sector investors, they are ready to forego the coupon, right? Let's say the World Bank bond, 5-year returns 2%, right? 100 million every year is 2 million coupon. Investors say, okay, I'll take the 2 million coupon, 5 years is 10 million, give it to the South Africa Rhino Preservation. But if it is successful, the Global Environmental Fund, which is a public trust, would pay the private investor, let's say 11 or 12, gives them a bit of a bonus. But as you said, if it is a failure, then private sector investors say, forget, I served a good cause, my principal is safe, right? But I don't receive the coupon, that's fine, my principal. So I just wanted to say that, we all have to think differently in this new era. How can we use creative ways, use public funds to catalyze, risk mitigate, to allow private funds to connect, and of course with ISSB standard. Yes.
That would be great concluding remarks, but I would like to give you a chance for peacemaking.
Well, I really appreciate ISSB. But we take it offline, right? I think with regards to capacity building, we introduced Sustainable Finance Academy in the bank, and I'm also chairing the Sustainable Finance Committee at the Federation of Egyptian Banks, and we're also focusing on this. Most important thing, on the 15th of November, if you're still here, we have a panel. It's about the evolution of education, global education system. We are not there. We are still addressing 21st century challenges and opportunities with the same 20th century educational system that siloed and fragmented knowledge. Finance, sustainability, E&S is not in finance major yet. It's an add-on, and this is very costly. Every day, every year, we have new generation of graduates that do not have the holistic education. So evolution of education is a fundamental issue. The same as accounting, which I hope ISSB will address.
So we should, from university, start to educate young people about sustainability, embedding that in every education. Indeed, whether it's accountants or financial analysts, by creating sustainability, it's also creating new jobs, of new ways of banking jobs, analysts, auditors, actuary studies. So this is also very interesting. Sorry for this coming. Yeah.
I mean, that's an invitation. On the 15th of November, we have this panel. It's Education for Sustainable Development.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, John.
So this brings us to an end of this discussion. I think we touched upon some of the most pressing issues when it comes to developing tools to effectively channel capital into transitional efforts, stress tests and transition plans, both in the financial industry and for corporates, can be helpful, but it is important that they are designed properly, they are credible, and they are comparable. Only if this is ensured, I think investors will be able to use them as a means to allocate capital where it's most useful. And I would like to stress again the importance of international standardization efforts and the work of the ISSB. I think it's key that all standardization efforts in the regional and in the national level are based on your work at the ISSB, because you are setting the baseline. Additionally, institutions, especially in the emerging markets where capital is often scarce, have to be enabled to use these tools and to attract capital. And efforts to build up the relevant capacity in institutions and thorough international cooperation should therefore be increased. I hope you found this panel as interesting as I did, and I would like to once again thank all the panelists for being available for this very exciting discussion, and I wish all of us a very successful COP27. Thanks a lot.